Welcome back to Board Game Wednesday. Today, we're going over the second round of our playthrough of Axis and Allies 1942 2nd Edition. In the first round, the Allies made some early gains, most notably the British occupation of the East Indies, throwing the Axis off their game a little bit. Can they recover and push on to Moscow, or will the Allies recreate history and crush the Axis empires? Only one way to find out.
Fall, 1942. The board enters its second turn of global war as the Axis attempt to gain world domination and the Allies work to destroy the forces of darkness. To see what happened in the opening of the game, check out the previous video over the first turn. The second turn will begin with the USSR. The Soviets had managed to push the front away from Moscow. However, the German armies remain just a few turns away from the capital and still pose a significant threat to other vital Soviet territories, most notably the factory in the Caucasus. In their eastern territories, the Japanese war machine was making steady advances towards Moscow. However, they did not yet have the forces to gamble taking on the Soviet defenders. For now, this front would be of secondary importance. Realistically, the Soviets had two targets to choose from: German Army Group North, currently occupying Karelia SSR, and the 3 tanks in Ukraine SSR. Karelia is a vital territory. Not only does it contain the victory city of Leningrad, but it also contains a factory that is both 1 territory away from Moscow and 1 territory away from Berlin. Whoever controls that factory can consistently put pressure on their enemy's capital. Despite all those strategic considerations, the Soviets did not believe they yet had the forces to attempt the liberation of Karelia. Their army in West Russia was evenly matched in hit points to the defenders, and even with air support, the odds were not stacked enough in their favor. They could not risk having their main force be eliminated. Even if they did defeat the German defenders, they would likely be significant casualties and simply be destroyed by German armor in a counterattack. Instead, the Soviets would attack the tanks in Ukraine with everything that could reach them. This would undoubtedly annihilate the valuable German tanks, as well as place a large Soviet force 2 territories away from Rome and 1 territory away from Berlin. The army in Karelia would have to be held off for now and dealt with later. The Soviets' first action will be to choose their build. With the front likely being pushed away from the Caucasus, the Soviets would not have to think about immediate defense. They would use 24 IPCs to create 4 tanks and spend the remaining 4 on 1 artillery. Hopefully, the Soviets would match the Germans in armor by the end of their turn. The Soviets would now go on the offensive. They would move all available units from West Russia and the Caucasus into Ukraine SSR, as well as the 2 fighters from Russia. The tank from West Russia would blitz through Belorussia on its way to Ukraine, capturing the territory. As expected, the German armor was destroyed in 1 round of combat, taking out 2 Soviet infantry in the process. The Soviets again controlled Ukraine, this time with 8 infantry, 1 artillery, and 1 tank. After the battle was concluded, the 2 Soviet fighters returned to Russia. The 2 infantry there were split up, one heading to West Russia and the other to Archangel. In the Atlantic, the Soviets anticipated an American invasion of Morocco. Their submarine in Sea Zone 7 surfaced and traveled to the Moroccan coast, ready to defend the American Navy upon their arrival. In the east, the Soviet armies in Yakut retreated to Evenki National Okrug. The Japanese would have to travel deep into Soviet territory before reaching their defensive line, where they would be far removed from their factories. The forces in Xinjiang would remain, so as to prevent the possibility of a 2-front assault on their northern army. The Soviets deployed all 4 tanks to the factory in the Caucasus. As the board stood right now, those tanks were in position to strike 3 different German armies. The artillery would be deployed in Russia. Despite losing 3 IPCs worth of territory to the Axis, the Soviet gains did lead them to collect 27 IPCs, 1 less than their previous haul, but still 3 more than their starting number. Nazi Germany was in a far greater predicament than they had initially realized. Their armies, which were once knocking on the door of the Soviet capital, were now holding weak defensive positions just outside of Germany. On top of that, their Baltic fleet had been completely wiped out, and now the Allied navies were quickly gearing up for an invasion. In the eyes of German high command, if they remained in a defensive posture, the Allies would be in Berlin before the Nazi war machine had time to build up. Immediate action had to be taken. The plan drawn up was well calculated, but still depended on a huge amount of luck, a worrying sign this early into the game. First, Nazi Germany would build an aircraft carrier, a destroyer, and a submarine, all destined for the Baltic Sea. Once boarded by the fighters in Norway, this naval strike group would hold a slight defensive edge over the current Royal Navy, giving the Kriegsmarine a real chance to build up. This would also temporarily block any chances of British landings in Germany via the Baltic Sea, at least for this one turn. Germany would finish by building a tank and an artillery bound for Karelia, and a single infantry for Germany. Now for the attack moves, Germany would send all of their forces from Poland, their infantry from Bulgaria, Romania, and their bomber from Germany into Ukraine. They would also send the tank from Karelia, blitzing through Belorussia in the process. The 7 infantry in Karelia would split into 2 forces. 4 infantry would attack West Russia, and 3 would attack Archangel, an offensive across the entire front. The fighting would start in Ukraine. Germany did not anticipate many survivors of this battle, but that wasn't the objective. They simply needed to destroy most, if not all, of the Soviet defenders, giving themselves time to build up a proper invasion force. The first roll resulted in 4 German hits and 3 Soviet hits. Pressing the attack, the second round netted the Germans 3 more hits, and the Soviets just 2. The Germans took a while to contemplate retreat. Seeing the possibility of an attack on Karelia if they did, however, the Germans persisted. Their gamble paid off. Roll 3 resulted in 2 German hits and no Soviet hits. The final roll finished off the Soviet tank, which took a German tank with them. Once again, the Nazis occupied Ukraine. This time, however, with just 1 tank. Still, High Command considered it a resounding success. The largest Soviet army on the board had been eliminated. Moving to West Russia, it took the Germans 2 rolls to defeat the defenders, with no casualties in return. An identical story played out in Archangel. The offensive proved far more successful than even German High Command predicted. While the gains would surely be mostly wiped away by the next turn, optimism was once again high on the German team. In the non-combat phase, the bomber returned to Germany, where the 3 artillery advanced into Poland. The infantry in northwestern Europe moved to France. Neither territory stood much chance against an Allied landing, so the Germans figured they might as well consolidate in the higher IPC count France, hopefully making a counterattack easier. The fighters in Norway were flown to Sea Zone 5, awaiting the deployment of the carrier. Interestingly, the Germans retreated the 2 infantry in Norway to Finland. The Germans intended to bring them all the way to the Eastern Front, seeing Norway as a lost cause in their current state. One area that had been overlooked was the Mediterranean and North Africa. With all the alarm that the Soviet advances caused the Germans, they had barely even considered what to do with the Africa Corps. In hindsight, the Germans were frustrated that they'd missed the opportunity to potentially take Egypt. They would not miss the opportunity again. The infantry and artillery in Algeria were advanced to Libya, and the infantry in Morocco was transported to Libya. The American Expeditionary Force was believed to be too much to handle at the moment. Germany would take Egypt first, then deal with the Americans. Finally, the Germans deployed their build. All 3 ships were launched in Sea Zone 5, and 1 infantry was placed in Germany. The remaining 2 units were deployed in Karelia, destined to see action soon. With their massive offensive, the Germans had both took control of all their starting territories and advanced deeper into Soviet territory. As such, they now collected 45 IPCs, running away with the title of strongest power on the board. The British Empire was definitely surprised by the result of Germany's turn. What had looked like a power at the beginning of the end by the start of its turn had now become a significant threat, at risk of annihilating the Soviets in a few turns. What really concerned the British was the new Baltic Fleet. The British would now have to spend more IPCs to defend their transports, delaying the buildup and deployment of troops into Europe. As for their forces in Egypt and South Asia, there wasn't much to do other than build up their defenses. The British would now pick their bill. In an attempt to stay well ahead of the Kriegsmarine's buildup, the British built 1 battleship and 1 submarine for the Atlantic, and 3 infantry for India. The United Kingdom would make just 1 attack move. The Atlantic Fleet would sail to Sea Zone 6, transporting 1 infantry and 1 artillery to Norway, taking it without incident. In the non-combat phase, the UK advanced their infantry in Rhodesia to Anglo-Egyptian Sudan and their infantry in the Transjordan to Egypt. This was all the Empire could do for Egypt at the moment. The Egyptian forces were, however, close in strength to the German Afrika Korps. Even if they were destroyed, the British reckoned, the American Expeditionary Force would make quick work of what was left of the Germans before too much damage could be done. In South Asia, the British pulled their colonial forces from Burma back into India, where they intended to make their stand against the Japanese. The battleship and submarine were cast off in Sea Zone 6, and the 3 infantry were deployed to India. With the capture of Norway, the UK collected 37 IPCs. All in all, the Empire was still confident in the direction the game was going, especially with America on the verge of fully entering the war. The Japanese needed to proceed carefully this turn. Germany had made several powerful moves. However, the British had kept said gains from putting the Allies in too precarious of a situation. If Imperial Japan didn't make the right plays, they could squander a great opportunity to get ahead of the Allies. With such a wide-reaching empire, Japan had multiple fronts they had to consider and manage. As such, they would build 3 tanks for Manchuria, a destroyer to boost the strength of their home fleet, and an artillery piece destined for the Japanese mainland. Their first target would be the East Indies. Retaking these money islands would be vital for the Japanese war machine. Plus, the strike force could then hit Australia and New Zealand, tying off the loose end posed by the Anzac, or even participate in the invasion of India. A transport in Sea Zone 61 ferried the infantry and artillery from Kwangtung to the island. They were supported by the carrier strike group in Sea Zone 47, which would launch its fighter to aid in the attack. The next target would be Burma, merely a stepping stone on the way to India. All ground units from French Indochina Thailand, the infantry and artillery from Yunnan, as well as the infantry and artillery from Japan moved in and occupied the territory. The IJA believed this army would be large enough to deter an Indian counterattack. The lone Japanese bomber would do a first for the game and attempt a strategic bombing raid on the factory in India. With a chance to crawl closer to the UK's IPC count, any disruption to the enemy's IPCs would prove monumental in gaining superiority. The IJN would also target the Soviet troops in Xinjiang, with the infantry in Anhui, the fighter in Manchuria, and the tank in Yunnan, which would blitz through and occupy Sichuan on the way. Finally, the infantry in Buryatia SSR would occupy the Soviet Far East. On their next turn, the IJA intended for these infantry to meet up with the tanks soon to be placed in Manchuria, and together lead the northern assault on the Soviet Union. With all movements made, it was time for combat. The strategic bombing would come first. Unfortunately for the Japanese, the Indian air defenses proved too great, and the bomber was shot down. A terrible start for the Japanese. The first battle would take place in the East Indies. Despite offshore bombardment, airstrikes, artillery fire, and banzai charges, the Indian colonial troops stood strong, losing just 1 unit and repelling the invasion. With no land units left, the Japanese retreated the fighter back to the carrier. In China, the IJA had more success. In 2 rolls, the Japanese defeated the Soviet defenders, losing 3 infantry in the process. Despite their success in Xinjiang, the Japanese considered the attack phase an overall failure. The army on the Sino-Russo border was weak and likely wouldn't survive any counterattacks, and the failure to capture the East Indies was crushing. Another turn without that money island surely would allow the British Empire to pull away an IPC count, not to mention the invasion of India would now be delayed even longer. Japan needed to strengthen the position they had and prepare for their next turn. The fighter in Xinjiang returned to Manchuria. The now unguarded transport in Sea Zone 61 sailed to Sea Zone 62 for protection by the destroyer. Lastly, the fighter in French Indochina Thailand would fly back to the mainland, aiding in its defense force. The American Expeditionary Force wasn't very big, but neither were the mainland defenses. The fighter was sent there as a deterrent more than anything. The Japanese placed an artillery on the mainland, another destroyer in Sea Zone 62, and 3 tanks to the factory in Manchuria. Despite their failure to retake the East Indies, the Japanese still made territorial gains and collected 33 IPCs, an increase of 3 from their previous amount. All things considered, the Americans saw themselves as holding the strongest position on the board. While their economy had fallen behind Germany's, they still held the second largest IPC count on the board. And, without the enemy knocking on their doorstep, they had much more freedom to build up, move, and attack than anyone else, including the other allies. The Americans could safely and confidently build up for both the European and Pacific theaters. First, a transport, infantry, artillery, and destroyer were built to take on Germany, while a cruiser and a tank were built for the Pacific. The first target would be Germany. The American bomber in the United Kingdom would strategically bomb the factory in Germany, attempting to cripple the German economy as much as possible. This would be followed by an amphibious invasion of Morocco, carried out by 4 transports worth of units, protected by a carrier strike group. In China, the 2 infantry and Kazakh SSR, supported by the nearby American fighter, would attack the Japanese tank and infantry in Xinjiang. Recapturing the territory wasn't really the goal. Rather, the Allies hoped to eliminate the enemy force, preventing Japanese incursions into the territories bordering Russia. The Japanese reinforcements would be a minimum 2 turns away, giving time for the Soviets to prepare a defensive plan. Finally, in the Pacific, the Americans continued their island hopping campaign. They chose to assault Iwo Jima next, seeing as there could be no serious Japanese naval or air counterattacks next turn. In the combat phase, strategic bombing would be dealt with first. The B-17 survived the German flak, successfully dealing 4 IPCs worth of damage to the factory. Down in Morocco, the Americans took the territory with no resistance. The Afrika Korps was now being squeezed from both sides. If the Egyptians couldn't eliminate them, the Americans surely would. The fight against Japan was far more brutal. In Xinjiang, the American units scored 0 hits on their opening roll, instead being completely wiped out by the Japanese defensive fire. The American fighter retreated back to Kazakh SSR, now in serious danger of being eliminated next turn. The landings in Iwo Jima were more successful. The combined naval, air, and ground assault destroyed the Japanese defender, but not without the loss of an American infantry. Still, the island had been cleared, and American bombers could now land right off the coast of the Japanese home island. With combat concluded, the American bomber flew back to the United Kingdom, and the US deployed its build. Even with the occupation of Morocco, the Americans only collected 39 IPCs, due to the complete loss of China this turn. Despite the failed assault on Xinjiang, the Americans had begun landings in North Africa, with the invasion of mainland Europe soon to follow. With only the Kriegsmarine posing the largest threat, the Allies could foresee a collapse to the Reich sooner rather than later.
And thus concludes round 2. Tough break for the Japanese over India and in the East Indies. Those Anzac and Indian troops are something else. What would you have done in the player's shoes? Perhaps roll better if you were Japan. Let us know down in the comments, and stay tuned for next Board Game Wednesday, where we'll go over the 3rd round of this second board war. As always, be sure to like and subscribe to EMFX Studios for more fun, nerdy content.